going to be refuting the claim that people who are exposed to media violence show higher signs of aggression. The reasons given were: 1, being witness to violence desensitizes us to violence, making it not such a big deal. 2, Albert Bandura's social learning theory suggests that watching violence teaches it. And 3, social research suggests a line between aggressiveness and violent expectations. So the dictionary defines media as the main means of mass communication, especially television, radio, newspapers, and the internet. So using this definition of media, the studies provided by the advocate expose potential causes for increased aggressiveness, which are violent adult models or video games, but do not sufficiently ground the claim that exposure to media violence and media violence alone results in increased aggression. I'm going to argue that the advocate failed to prove her case through use of weak data. I found that the evidence provided by the advocate failed to adequately ground her claim that being witness to violence desensitizes us to violence. Second, Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiment made wide generalizations. And third, Yusuf Hassan's violent video game study failed to account for alternative causes of aggression. So my first claim is that the evidence provided by the advocate failed to adequately ground her claim that being witness to violence desensitizes us to violence. In the longitudinal study provided by the advocate, psychologists L. Raoul Huseman and Leonard Aaron followed 4 children from the 1980s to the 2000s and found that the 2 children who watched many hours of violence on television showed higher levels of aggression later in life than their counterparts. This sample size of 4 is far too small to adequately represent the total population. Further, according to Yusuf Hassan, a doctor in experimental social psychology, because longitudinal studies employed correlational methods, it is difficult to make strong causal inferences based on longitudinal data. A small sample size and findings based on correlational research, which do not establish a cause and effect relationship, but only a relationship between the 2 factors, is not sufficient enough to back the claim that people who are exposed to media violence show higher signs of aggression. My second claim is that Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiment made wide generalizations. The participants in the study were drawn from a narrow pool of students. They all came from the Stanford University Nursery School and all shared the same racial and socioeconomic backgrounds. And this kind of sample is not representative of the total population either. Or environmental cues such as social and economic standing, race, and political views factor into child development, which was integral to this study, which tested watching violence teaches it. Again, according to Yusuf Hassan, it is not so much the immediate short-term causal effects of media violence that are of concern, but rather the cumulative long-term effects. In this study, data was collected immediately after, so making a long-term analysis was difficult to make. The inferential leap here is that because children imitated the adult models in that particular instance, the Bobo doll experiment can adequately serve as evidence for the claim that people are exposed to media violence show higher signs of aggression. Once again, the adult models used in this experiment are not comparable to the dictionary forms of media. My third claim is that Yusuf Hassan's violent video game study failed to account for alternative causes of aggression. Ultimately, the study found that hostile expectations and aggressive behaviors increased over time for violent video game players, but not for non-violent video game players. However, in the results section of this experiment, violent game players started off with more hostile expectations and aggression. So the results weaken the claim because clearly these players were predisposed to aggressive tendencies before the violent model was tested. Christopher J. Ferguson, associate professor of the psychology at Stetson University in Florida, claim that much of the research into video game violence has failed to control for other variables such as mental health and family life, which may have impacted the results. Here again, video games are not comparable to the dictionary forms of media, which the main claim was centered around. In conclusion, causative studies attempting to find a link between violent models and increased aggression have fallen victim to correlative rather than causative results, wide generalizations, and misrepresentations of single cause due to failure to control for other variables. These findings weaken the claim that people who are exposed to media violence show higher signs of aggression.
All right, well, like we had in an earlier speech, we got a preview of what the advocates' claims were, then we got a preview of what your responses are going to be to those claims, and I think you could probably save those until you get to the claims and respond to them individually, because it got a little bit confusing at the beginning. The explanation of media, appreciated the fact that you offered a definition here, because this definition actually gets used in your argument, because you are saying that the stuff that was being researched doesn't meet the definition of media as it is being described by the advocate. So that's an effective way of using a definitional point as opposed to simply presenting a definition and then never referring back to it again. I appreciated the extra effort that you made on that point. On the first point on the failure of correlation, I thought that you did a nice job presenting the advocate's evidence and summarizing it very quickly, and then being very quick to criticize that information. You also cited a source that suggested there are all kinds of problems with longitudinal research and explains the correlational issue pretty well. It sounds to me, as I'm listening to this, like the evidence that you cite on the first and the second points that is vastly criticizing the arguments that the advocate is presenting. Then you turn around and start criticizing the source that you are using on the third point. So it's a little bit awkward. It's an interesting point. I think the better when you get to that last point, when you explain the reason you're saying it's not really the same type of media, okay, I can see what you're talking about. But I just thought it was kind of interesting that the evidence that you're using to criticize on points 1 and 2, you then turn around and criticize the scholar who's doing that kind of research on the third point. That might be a little bit iffy on those sorts of issues. There might be another way to go after that third point. Like I said, I thought you did a good job explaining the concept on the first point, and on the second point, explaining that there is an argument that's being presented here that says that we have to be looking at the long-term effects, and that the study that is being used here was not long-term in nature. I appreciated that. I thought that was pretty good. There's also a good argument that says that they are not very representative. I think you needed a little bit of evidence on that. I'm sure that that's true. It's just a description of what the research was. I'm not sure if it came from the original source, or if it was done by Hassan later on when he's evaluating the information there. So I think you could be a little bit more consistent about that. And then, like I said, on the last point, I think that that's where you kind of come back and use your definitional issue much more effectively. And I thought you had a good summary at the end, too. Thank you.